Welcome, everyone, to another edition of SCRC's Let's Talk Caregiving. I'm your host, Roberto Velasquez, President and CEO of Southern Caregiver Resource Center. And I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Marta Rañón, our Executive Vice President. How are you doing today, Marta?
I'm doing well, Roberto. Nice to be here.
Great. I'm so glad we're doing this again. Today's special guest is James Wieme. James is a clinical counselor program supervisor with Elizabeth Hospice, providing hospice and community bereavement services for all ages, including individual counseling, facilitating support groups, supervising master's level students who are gaining experience in grief counseling, and providing presentations related to grief and loss. I want to thank you so much for joining us today, James. Glad you're here.
Thank you. My pleasure.
James, welcome to our podcast, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation because during this time of the year, we often get questions from our clients, from our caregivers, who want to know more about preparing for hospice care. And maybe we can start by defining what is hospice, because I think sometimes it gets confused with palliative care. And maybe you can give us a quick definition and understanding of what that is.
Sure. Hospice care is really tailored to someone with a terminal diagnosis seen to be about 6 months. And in that time of 6 months, care will be provided. Really that wraparound sense of assistance through the hospice. So the physical needs of the patient, and then the supportive nature and bringing in the family and or friends for caregiving so that the person has the opportunity of dignity at end of life.
I'm really glad that you were talking about that aspect of caregiving and bringing the family, because obviously at this point in a care receiver's life, it is important for the family, or at least the caregivers who are involved, to really understand what the next process is. That can be very daunting. It could be very much an emotional period of turmoil. Sometimes there's denial and all of the stages of grief that go along with it. And so I'm glad that we're having this conversation, because the questions that we often get are, when do you know when to activate hospice for someone?
If you have the benefit of knowing hospice, you activate sooner. Very often people rely upon their medical provider, their primary care provider, to say, I think it's time for hospice. Some of it's by experience, and some of it is by the professional that you are working with. And the more experience the medical provider has with hospice, the sooner they tend to initiate hospice care. And from my perspective, get into hospice sooner rather than later. You can always graduate and move to a different level of care.
You know, one of the things that is really important, I'm glad we're having these conversations, because I wanted to talk a little bit about this, if possible, James. You know, when people think about hospice, we think about end of life. We think about services for the individual, you know, keeping them comfortable, so forth and so on. And then we have the family and the family caregiver, and they're going through grief and loss right in front of their eyes. And it is sometimes can become so devastating for them as well, because it's their loved one, it's their husband, their wife, maybe their child, a sister, brother. Grief counseling is a whole kind of different level of counseling, right? I mean, we provide counseling services for family caregivers, and it's really important. It's CBT, it's cognitive behavioral therapy. We work at problem solve and things of that nature. And many of the clients that we're working with, our caregivers, they have, you know, that ambiguous loss happening, right? Their loved one has Alzheimer's. Every day it changes. Every day there's a little bit of a loss. Sometimes it's a good day. A lot of times it's a bad day. So the counseling programs, we teach them how to deal with those emotions of up and down and the grief and so forth. But now you have grief counseling. You know the person's is terminal. 6 months, he said, 6 months left. Tell us a little bit more about grief counseling, and maybe if you have any stories you'd like to share of how some people have gotten through with, or you've helped with grief counseling.
Okay. There's two aspects of the grief counseling that I can be involved with, or my team really, and that's either pre-bereavement or in that post-bereavement where there's been an actual termination of life, in a death, and that's a hard word to hear. It's a hard word to say, and it's a very, after a period of mourning and loss, then it's okay. The euphemisms in that, just that quick passing, that within days after, or even that first month, our person passed, or they've moved on, or they've gone to another place. Whereas eventually in the grief counseling, part of that acceptance of the loss is to start to say that very final, very forever word of dying or death, as that's so terminal and so very painful to hear. In the pre-bereavement aspect of the caregiver, I tend to get buy-in immediately with my clients, and I say, if you so choose to continue to work with me, one of my goals of our counseling experience will be that you will have no regrets. So I will push you into the stories, into the relationship, and away from your role as caregiver, and to identify that you are either a caregiver who is in relationship, either as spouse, child, parent, grandparent. Are you able to experience, and that's part of the hospice wraparound, is to let the family members or the relationship member process.
I think that is really important that you say this, because oftentimes as caregivers, we lose that relationship role because we're the caregiver. I mean, that's what our focus is. And in fact, sometimes after, the caregiving responsibilities are over, the individual doesn't know what to do anymore, doesn't know their role. And even that becomes part of the whole after death kind of counseling as well, is what about me? I don't know what to do anymore because I've been a caregiver for the last 8 years.
So maybe, James, you can tell us a little bit how you support the families as they're going through this journey, these steps. What are the next things to consider when they are facing these decisions and really end of life for the person that they've been caring for?
Sure. To know that every caregiver is in a unique situation. Every family is in a unique situation. However, within that unique situation, there are some typicals. And the hospice benefit is that you have access to not just a medical provider, a nursing, that medical need of the physical care aspects for the patient or the person who's the receiver, but we also have then a medical social worker who can ask the questions, who can have resources to say, you will need a mortuary. You might need assistance with housing, shelter, food. What are those? So those practical needs that could also be part of the process. As the therapist, I very often get called in when a family system is in some form of a distress. Maybe we've heard that term overused, the dysfunctional family. There may be other concerns that are already known within the system, mental health, other traumas, things that are affecting this system's dying process. And we know that precursors for some long-term difficulty or prolonged grief can be due to a pre-existing condition in mental health. And if I were to name, if I start naming them, I would have to name all of them, and not one affects the same way and how it's been managed. There can also be substance use histories from both the receiver and or within the family system itself, in which that can be causing distress. And these will continue and show up later, but very often we have the family system that's challenged when we really are looking and seeking peace for this care, for the care receiver, that the patient, that we would say. And sometimes I step in to either give courage to the care provider so that they can segment or are given permission to be avoidant of those unhealthy or undesired relationships that are trying to get involved. Yeah.
I'm
Martha?
glad that you're talking about the undesired relationships or the aspects, because I know that in talking to some caregivers who are facing, this decision to place someone in hospice, and there is the end of life, it's moving in that direction, that caregivers often get not very helpful questioning from family members. Why aren't you doing more to save this person's life? I remember talking to a caregiver in particular, and she was caring for her mother, and the doctor had said, okay, I think it was like 3 months, and this person had lived a long life, and was just coming to that point in her life. And because the family was saying, you need to do more, you need to go to a different doctor, you need to get a second opinion, then she kind of started questioning herself. Well, maybe I do need to question this, get a different opinion, question what's happening. And it wasn't until she sat down with the doctor that the doctor had to really explain it to her. She's 98 years old. Her body is shutting down. There is nothing that can be done to go back in time. And so it really took an awareness that had been kind of convoluted by all of these different comments and decisions. So I guess my question to you is, how do you help caregivers kind of be certain and sure in this decision so that they don't get pulled in different directions from maybe other family members?
Right. And in this whole conversation is the other side of the coin. And just earlier, it's fun that you say the 98-year-old person, and I used that earlier with someone. I go, it's amazing how a family will have someone who is of these advanced years of what, 98 is an advanced year. And hospice is not encouraging, and we're not pushing anyone off the planet. However, we are preparing for that at some point. It's really interesting when we have somebody who's in the hospice care or coming in at that bereavement, that post, death, who says, "Oh, I thought we had longer." How, well, the person was 98 years old and we thought we had longer. And so there was a lot of non-preparation done, and they're, I don't want to use those over again, that sense of denial, because I don't want to cloud in that. But no one wants our person to terminate here. But there are also within that, we don't want them to terminate, but I don't also want them in that difficulty of watching all of the little pieces falling off until all of a sudden there's big chunks missing, and our person, it's so painful to watch that. It would be, it's rip the Band-Aid off real quickly, or do you pull it off in slow, and you won't know which is better until you are experiencing the one that you don't want to be having. And it's not the ultimate situation is we have a loss of life, and it was in relationship to us, and that was important to us. And so whether it was a quick termination or whether it was very slow, if you had a quick, you want the slow, and if you had the slow, you want the quick. So we get what we get, and we want to be prepared for that.
Thank you, James. What about the family that goes through, grief counseling and bereavement counseling? How long do you do bereavement counseling? I mean, can it be endless? Is there a cutoff? Because I do know, like for us, when we have our counseling sessions, it's an evidence-based CBT counseling program, but it has a limit, right? There's so many sessions that are provided. And then if the family needs more, we can do some more support, not necessarily counsel them again through the same program. So we often will refer them on to more, longer term type counseling. But, how does that work with your group when somebody wants more or needs more, or feels they need more. Yeah.
Sure, sure. The hospice benefit is for 13 months within our organization. So after there's been a death, we will offer or be available for support for those who are identified as family or relationship friendships for 13 months. And in that time, they might be people who come for counseling up front. They might be those who come because it's in the middle. Maybe your person passed in June. Well, now the holidays and their favorite holiday happen to be, starting Halloween, Dia de los Muertos, then November, and then December holidays. And these are very difficult for families who have experienced loss. And the chairs are empty at the table, and it's obvious. And that's, if you get to that holiday and go, I should have prepared better. So that full year is very important to be attentive to what the grief process is. After 13 months, depending on what's going on, we have a plan that we can do. The difficulty is that we love, as at least someone who grew up in North County, San Diego, California, and this is my population I work with and that I know and I'm product of. We want those beautiful, clean, I do this step, I do this step, I do this step, and I do this step. And as a therapist, I get to say there's no direct line, there's no straight line. And if you loved your person, they will always have died on that day. They will always have been in relationship to you as they are in life. So they will always have been your parent. They will always have been your sister. They will always have been your spouse. That grief will continue as long as you are. It changes in how you are able to manage and carry it. Some people would love for me to say, oh, it gets better. And I really work really hard in my vocabulary to not say grief gets better, because there's that application of, I want this to be over. Well, if you really, tears are liquid love. And do you really want that love to be extinguished? Then you shouldn't have ever gotten into a relationship with them. It's sort of that kind of this person will always have been that important to you. You learn to carry, or David Kessler, who is one of our grief theorists, talks about you accommodate. The space becomes, and it is very heavy and difficult to move in the beginning, whereas eventually, as you develop the muscle to manage, it moves more freely. And instead of only thinking of the sad and difficult time of the dying process, you then go back to, why do I love this person? The dating, the anniversaries, the birthdays, the delightful sense of humor, the silly things, or the fun stories, and to remember the travel and the trips, and that comes along a bit further. And then you are carrying the grief. And there's another author that discusses the continuing bond of that relationship. I was in relationship when they were physically present. Now they are in relationship as memory, and in their generativity, whether I see their face in my grandchild or in my sibling, or in the sayings that get bantered about, or the stories that are told at the holiday table. And those are what I encourage in my process of. And of course, how did this person so affect you?
I'm so glad that you mentioned that, James, because I was thinking as you were talking about my situation when I was a family caregiver. And although I knew that my aunt's life was coming to an end, and she was also in hospice, and so it was inevitable, it was still difficult, but that preparation helped me to understand it. Obviously, it didn't change it. Obviously, I still was distraught and I still was sad. But I was able to prepare so that as the caregiver, as the person who was in charge of all the logistics and her care, once that time period passed, then I was able to recall those memories that you're talking about, remember her. And yes, I still think about, I would say really, and I hadn't even thought about this. I think I think about her, if not every day, every other day, in just little things that remind me of her. And that is beautiful. But no, now I no longer get sad where I'm, kind of mourning the loss. I'm actually happy with the great memories that we created. And so I do think, yes, maybe with time things get more manageable, but I think what it is really our perception and our understanding of what we need as grieving caregivers to take the time and to understand fully the process. And I think that's why it's important to have services like the ones that our organizations provide, because sometimes that is what we need, right? We don't need somebody telling us she's 98, do everything possible to have her live 10 more years, when that's not a reality. I know that's what helped me through this a lot.
Thanks, Martha, for sharing that. When you were saying that, I was remembering because both my parents have passed, and my mother was on hospice. My dad, when he passed away, it was pretty sudden. It's a massive heart attack. And my mom, she had a cancer, and it took a little bit longer. And but she was on hospice, and now that was several years ago. And as you're saying, Martha, I'll hear a song on the radio, and it just reminds me of something neat, something fun,
Mm-hmm.
or a joke or something. Or when we get together for the holidays, James, when you were talking about the empty table, I remember at the beginning looking at that, going to my mom's house where we used to gather because my sister's there, and it just felt different. Something, that void was not there because my mom wasn't there. And but now it's more like happy thoughts, it's good thoughts, it's funny thoughts. The kind of things, the things that you hold on to and remember, not so much the sad part of the loss, but no,
Mm-hmm.
it's a good emotion, right? So, anyways, I mean, this topic is just amazing, and I'm so glad you're here, James. And any last thoughts for our listeners? I know it's a short segment, but we got to start wrapping up. But any last thoughts that you have for our listeners?
Absolutely. Absolutely. When I'm with the care providers, I hear, if I had 5 more minutes, do they know I loved them? So say I love you, get a 5 minute intentional, just hold and hug and love on them and say I love you. And for the care providers, stop questioning if you did enough, if you were good enough. You are.
Mm-hmm.
You are amazing. And say I love you and hear the I love you. And actions are I love yous as much and even more so than the words. I just hate hearing that. And I know that that's the typical. If I could even have 5 minutes, I want 1 minute, just one
Mm-hmm.
more minute, and we can't have that.
That's
That would be
wonderful. I
my.
thank you very much for sharing that with our audience. I think that's a great message to close with. Say I love you, whether they're on hospice or not, right? To your loved
Exactly.
ones, say I love you, I love you, and say I love you to yourself too, because I think that's
Oh
a
yeah.
part of self-care as well. And you got to take care of your own mental health to be able to be a good caregiver. So thank you very much. Well, that's all the time we have left for this edition of Let's Talk Caregiving. To hear more of our podcasts, follow us on your favorite podcasting platforms or visit our website at scrc.care. I want to thank Martha for co-hosting another important discussion, James Wieme for joining us today, and our audience for tuning in. If you're providing support to a loved one, you don't have to do this alone. Asking for help is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength. To connect to our programs and services, visit our website at scrc.care or call us at 1-800-827-1008. If you live outside of San Diego and Imperial counties, visit caregivercalifornia.org to connect to the nearest Caregiver Resource Center in your area. To support our efforts and make a tax-deductible donation, please go to scrc.care and click on the Donate tab. And remember, SCRC is here for you,
caring for those who care for others.